There is a category of mistake that is made not from malice, but from a failure of imagination so complete that it produces consequences identical to malice. The person who makes this kind of mistake is not trying to do harm. They are simply unable to imagine that the object of their decision is anything other than what it appears to be on the surface, which is to say, they look at something with complexity and depth and history and significance, and they see only the surface, and they act on what the surface tells them without any curiosity about what is underneath. The HOA board of Cedarwood Commons looked at my blueberry farm and saw land. Flat, cleared, accessible land adjacent to their community's overflow event parking situation. They did not see what the land actually was, what it had taken to make it, what federal programs had supported it, what regulatory frameworks governed it, what obligations it carried that were binding and enforceable by agencies they had never thought about in 6 years of running a community governance organization. They saw land and they decided to make it a parking lot. What happened next was not something I orchestrated or planned. I am not strategic in the way that some of the people in stories like this are strategic. I did not have a plan. What I had was a phone, a list of contacts developed over 14 years of running a federally enrolled agricultural operation, and the specific professional habit of a working farmer who knows that when something threatens the farm, you call everyone who has a stake in it, because the farm's survival depends on the network of support around it. I made calls. The calls produced responses. The responses, when they arrived at the offices of the people who had decided my farm was a parking lot, arrived with the weight and the authority of federal agricultural programs that had been enrolled in my farm's production for over a decade, and that had, as a consequence of that enrollment, a legally enforceable interest in my land's agricultural use that neither the HOA nor anyone else had the authority to override. But I need to start at the beginning, because the beginning is important, and because the farm itself is the thing, and you need to understand what the farm was before you can understand what was at stake when someone tried to turn it into a parking lot. My name is Margaret Holloway. I am 61 years old. I am a blueberry farmer, not as a hobby, not as a retirement project, but as a full-time commercial operation that I have been running for 14 years on a 12-acre parcel at the edge of what became the Cedarwood Commons community. I started the farm when I was 47, which is not a typical age to start a farming career, having spent the previous 20 years working as an agricultural extension agent for the state university system, teaching farmers about soil health and crop management and business practices. I decided at 47 that I had been teaching long enough and that I wanted to do, and I knew blueberries well enough from extension work to make an informed choice about what to grow. The 12 acres I planted were not cheap or easy to establish. Blueberry farming is not like row cropping. You do not plant blueberries in spring and harvest them in summer. You plant blueberry bushes and you wait 3 years before they produce meaningfully and 5 years before they produce at commercial scale. And during those years, you invest in soil amendment and irrigation infrastructure and pest management and all the operational systems that a commercial berry operation requires. The investment per acre for a blueberry operation at commercial scale is substantial, and the return on that investment is dependent on the plants living and producing for 20 or 30 years, which means the land cannot be disturbed. I had enrolled the farm in 2 federal agricultural programs that were directly relevant to what happened. The first was the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service Environmental Quality Incentives Program, EQIP, which had provided cost-share funding for my irrigation infrastructure and soil health practices in exchange for a 10-year commitment to maintain the land in agricultural production according to an approved conservation plan. My EQIP contract had 8 years remaining when the HOA made its move. The second was the USDA Farm Service Agency's Conservation Reserve Program, CRP, which had enrolled 2 acres of my farm's buffer strips in a 15-year conservation easement in exchange for annual payments and in exchange for my commitment to maintain those acres in perennial vegetative cover. My CRP contract had 11 years remaining. Both programs were binding contracts between me and the federal government. Both contracts obligated me to maintain the enrolled land in its designated use, agricultural production for EQIP, perennial vegetative conservation for CRP. Both contracts carried repayment provisions. If the land was converted from its enrolled use, I was required to repay all program benefits received, with interest plus penalties. Both contracts also gave the relevant federal agencies, NRCS and FSA, a legal interest in the land's use that was senior to any private party's claim on that use. I am telling you all of this before I tell you about the HOA because the farm's legal and regulatory situation is the foundation of everything that follows, and because understanding it is the only way to understand why the HOA's decision to use my land as a parking lot was not just wrong as a matter of property rights, but wrong in a way that activated a response from federal agencies that the HOA had no framework for comprehending. The Cedarwood Commons community had grown up around my farm over the years since I established it. When I bought my land and started farming it 14 years ago, the adjacent property to the north and east was undeveloped. A developer named Pinnacle had purchased it 6 years after I started farming and had built Cedarwood Commons, a 200-unit residential community with a clubhouse, a pool, and amenity spaces. The community had been built up to the boundary of my farm on the south and west, with a 6-foot wooden fence marking the boundary between the community's landscaped common areas and my rows of blueberry bushes. The community had a parking situation. The main parking lot served the residential streets adequately for daily use, but the community hosted regular events, summer concerts, fall festivals, a holiday market that drew attendance from outside the community and that exhausted the available parking. On event days, cars spilled onto the surrounding roads and created the kind of congestion that generates complaints and that HOA presidents in particular find embarrassing. Helen Crawford had been the Cedarwood Commons HOA president for 6 years. She was organized, energetic, community-focused, and possessed of the particular executive confidence that well-run community organizations produce in their leaders. She was not a bad person, and she was not a dishonest person. She was a person who had identified a problem, parking, and had identified a solution, the flat, accessible land adjacent to the community's southern boundary, and who had failed to investigate the solution with any of the rigor that a competent executive would normally bring to a decision of this magnitude. She had not looked up who owned the land. She had apparently assumed it was vacant or available or in some status that did not preclude its use for the community's purposes. She had not looked at the county agricultural parcel records. She had not looked at any USDA program records. She had not walked the boundary and examined what was on the other side of the fence. She had looked at the land from the community's side, seen flat cleared ground beyond the fence, and decided it was the answer to her parking problem. The first indication I had that anything was happening was a letter from the HOA's attorney stating that the HOA was proposing to exercise a community access provision in the Cedarwood Commons CC and RS. The conditions, covenants, and restrictions that govern the community to establish a temporary overflow parking area on the undeveloped land to the community's south. The letter requested my cooperation in providing access and said the HOA expected to begin surface preparation within 30 days. I read that letter several times, very slowly, in the particular way that a person reads something that they cannot initially make sense of. My land was not undeveloped. My land had 12 acres of blueberry bushes on it, in organized rows, with drip irrigation infrastructure running through every row, with soil management berms and drainage features, with the 2 CRP buffer strip acres in the corners with their required perennial vegetation. To call my farm undeveloped was, from the perspective of the letter's author, an innocent error made by someone who had not stood on my side of the fence and looked at what was there. But the error was the foundation of the entire plan, and when the foundation was wrong, the plan was wrong in every dimension. I called my attorney, a woman named Sandra Pierce, who had handled my land purchase and my farm's legal matters for 14 years. I read her the letter. She was quiet for a moment, and then she asked me 3 questions. She asked whether the community access provision in the CC and RS could actually apply to my land, which was not part of the Cedarwood Commons development and was not bound by the CC and RS. She asked what the status of my federal agricultural program contracts was, and she asked whether I wanted to respond to this quietly through letters or loudly through every available channel. I said I wanted to think about the first two questions and that the answer to the third was probably both, in the right sequence. Sandra said the CC and RS community access provision applied to common areas within the Cedarwood Commons development and to properties that had signed on to the CC and RS at the time of purchase. My property had never been part of the development, had never signed on to the CC and RS, and was not bound by them in any way. The HOA's attorney's letter was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what the CC and RS covered. The provision they were citing did not apply to my land. It had never applied to my land. The HOA had no more authority to establish a parking area on my property than a random stranger walking past my driveway. I had expected this. What I had not fully thought through until Sandra raised the second question was the federal dimension. I called my NRCS contact, the Natural Resources Conservation Service agent who administered my EQIP contract. His name was Tom Whitfield, and he had been my NRCS contact for 9 years. I described the situation. Tom listened carefully and then said several things in quick succession. He said my EQIP contract specifically prohibited conversion of the enrolled land from agricultural production to non-agricultural use. He said surface preparation for a parking lot, gradding, compaction, gravel or paving application would constitute conversion. He said conversion during the contract period would trigger the full repayment provision plus penalties. He said the repayment amount, with interest and penalties at the current stage of the contract, was a figure he would calculate precisely, but that was in the range of substantial. He also said, and this was the part I had not anticipated, that the NRCS had a legal interest in the enrolled land's use that they were required by regulation to protect, and that if they became aware of an intended conversion, they were obligated to take protective action. I asked what protective action meant. Tom said it meant that the NRCS could, and in the case of an identified threat to enrolled land would, issue a conservation plan compliance notice to the land's owner, me, and to any party identified as threatening the enrolled use, and that the notice would document the federal program's interest in the land and the legal consequences of proceeding with the conversion. I said the HOA was the party threatening the enrolled use. Tom said then the notice would go to them. I called my FSA contact, the Farm Service Agency agent who administered my CRP contract. Her name was Linda Cho, and she had been my FSA contact for 7 years. I described the situation. Linda's response was similar to Tom's in structure, but different in one important way. The CRP easement on my 2 buffer strip acres was a recorded instrument. It was in the county land records, and it constituted a federal lien on those acres for the duration of the contract. Any conversion of those acres from their enrolled use was a violation of a recorded federal easement, which was a matter that FSA was authorized to refer to the Department of Justice for enforcement. She said she would need to verify the specific parcel geometry to determine whether the threatened parking area would impact the CRP acres, and she asked me to send her the parcel map showing my farm's layout. I sent her the parcel map. The 2 CRP buffer strip acres were in the southwestern corner of my farm, which was the corner closest to the Cedarwood Commons southern boundary. If the HOA's parking area expanded to the south side of the community, it would have run directly into the CRP acres. Linda called back and confirmed the CRP acres were in the path of the planned parking expansion. I sat in my farm office with the notes from both calls and thought about the sequence that was going to follow. The HOA had sent a letter based on a misunderstanding of their own CC and RS, asserting authority over land they had never had authority over. for a purpose that would violate 2 federal agricultural contracts and a recorded federal easement. They were going to hear from me, through Sandra, that they had no legal basis for any of this. They were also going to hear from Tom at NRCS and from Linda at FSA, neither of whom had any interest in the HOA's parking situation, and both of whom had regulatory obligations they were required to fulfill when enrolled land was threatened. The HOA had knocked on a door without knowing what was behind it. What was behind it was 12 acres of federally enrolled blueberry farm, 2 federal contracts with repayment provisions, a recorded federal easement, and the specific professional network of a 14-year licensed farmer who had been navigating federal agricultural programs long enough to know exactly who to call. Sandra sent the formal response letter to the HOA's attorney the following day. The letter explained, with legal precision, that my property was not part of the Cedarwood Commons development, was not bound by the CC&RS, and that the community access provision the HOA had cited did not and had never applied to my land. The letter demanded withdrawal of the parking area proposal within 15 days. It noted that federal agricultural regulatory agencies had been notified of the threatened land use change and that their responses were pending. The HOA's attorney acknowledged receipt. Tom Whitfield at NRCS issued the Conservation Plan Compliance Notice within a week. Linda Cho at FSA issued a CRP Easement Protection Notice 2 days later. Both notices went to the HOA's attorney, to the HOA board, and to Helen Crawford personally. And then the USDA inspectors arrived. I want to be precise about what the USDA inspection was and was not, because the word inspectors carries a connotation of dramatic law enforcement action that is not quite accurate to what happened, while also not being entirely inaccurate. The inspectors who arrived were not carrying badges and making arrests. They were USDA program compliance personnel, field agents from the NRCS and FSA offices, whose job was to assess the threat to enrolled land and document the situation for their agency's records. They were professional, methodical, and entirely calm. They were also, in the context of what the HOA had been planning, exactly the kind of presence that makes plans stop. Tom Whitfield came himself rather than sending a field agent, which I interpreted as a signal that he understood the situation was significant and wanted to handle it personally. Linda Cho sent 2 FSA field agents who conducted an independent assessment of the CRP acreage and its status. The inspections happened on the same day by coordination between the 2 agencies, which was efficient and which meant the HOA received documentation from 2 separate federal agencies within the same 24-hour period. I was present for Tom's inspection. We walked the farm together, all 12 acres, row by row, looking at the blueberry bushes, the irrigation infrastructure, the soil condition, the buffer strips. Tom made notes and took photographs. He was particularly thorough with the southwestern corner where the CRP acres were, measuring the boundary with a GPS unit and documenting the relationship between the CRP acres and the Cedarwood Commons fence line. He said, as we walked, that the farm looked healthy. I said it was. I said it was the healthiest it had ever been, actually, because the soil management program we had been implementing under the EQIP conservation plan had produced a soil biology in the blueberry rows that I had not been able to achieve in the early years of the operation. He said he was glad to hear it, and that this was exactly the kind of outcome the program was designed to produce. He said it would be a shame to lose it to a parking lot. I said yes, it would. The FSA field agents completed their inspection of the CRP acres without incident and filed their report. The inspection documented that the CRP easement was valid, that the enrolled acres were in compliance with the conservation plan, and that the proposed parking expansion, based on the site geometry, would encroach on the CRP acres in a manner that would violate the recorded easement. Within 48 hours of the inspections, the HOA's attorney received the following documentation: Tom's formal NRCS compliance notice with a detailed description of the EQIP contract's terms and the specific consequences of the threatened conversion. The FSA Field Agents Inspection Report documenting the CRP easement status and the encroachment threat. A formal letter from the FSA Regional Director noting that the CRP easement was a recorded federal instrument and that any violation of its terms would be referred to the Department of Justice, and Sandra's legal analysis of the CC and RS application error attached to a formal demand that the parking proposal be withdrawn. The HOA's attorney called Sandra within a day of receiving this package. The attorney's tone, Sandra told me afterward, was the tone of a professional who has reviewed a situation and reached a clear conclusion about it. He said the HOA was withdrawing the parking area proposal. He said the withdrawal was unconditional. He said the HOA would not be pursuing any alternative approach to using my land for community purposes without my explicit written consent. He asked whether there were any additional matters that needed to be addressed. Sandra said there were. She said the HOA's letter asserting CC and RS authority over my property had been based on a material misunderstanding that the HOA's attorney should have identified before sending the letter. She said I expected a written acknowledgement that my property was not subject to the CC and RS, and that no future assertion of CC and RS authority over my property would be made. She said I also expected reimbursement of my attorney fees and the time I had spent on the matter. The attorney said he would discuss those terms with his client. Helen Crawford called me directly the following day. It was the first time she and I had spoken. She said she had not understood what the land south of the community was or what it was enrolled in when she had instructed her attorney to send the initial letter. She said she should have investigated the situation more thoroughly before acting. She said she was sorry for the disruption to my operation and that the HOA would meet the terms Sandra had outlined. I said I appreciated the call and the acknowledgement. I said I hoped we could have a straightforward neighborly relationship going forward. She said she hoped so too. The written acknowledgement arrived within a week. The attorney fees were reimbursed within 30 days. Helen Crawford brought the situation to the HOA board at the next meeting. She described the full sequence of events, the CC and RS misapplication, the federal program dimensions, the inspection process, and the resolution. She said the board needed to understand what had happened and why, and she said it as someone who had processed the experience and was determined that the board learn from it. The board's response, based on what I heard from a homeowner I knew who attended the meeting, was a combination of embarrassment about the original error and genuine interest in understanding what the federal agricultural programs were and why they existed. One board member apparently asked whether they could tour the farm. Helen relayed that request to me through Sandra. I said yes. The board tour happened on a Saturday morning in October, which was the tail end of the blueberry harvest season and a good time to see the operation in action. Helen brought 4 board members and 2 other interested homeowners. I walked them through the farm the same way Tom had walked it with me: rows of blueberry bushes, the irrigation infrastructure, the soil management program, the buffer strips, the equipment shed, the processing and packing area where the harvested berries were prepared for market. I explained the EQIP program and the CRP program and what they were designed to do and why they mattered for farm viability and for the environmental health of the land. The board member who had asked about the tour, a man named George who was retired from a career in agronomy and who clearly knew what he was looking at, said the farm was one of the better managed small commercial berry operations he had seen. He said the soil health in the rows was exceptional. I said thank you and that it had taken 10 years of consistent management to get there. Helen said, standing in the middle of a blueberry row with the October light coming through the canopy of leaves, that she wished she had walked the farm before sending the letter. She said seeing it made it impossible to imagine how she had thought of it as an empty lot. I said the fence between the community and the farm was quite tall. She said that was not really an excuse. I said no, it was not, but it was an explanation. We stood in the blueberry row for a while. The berries that had not been harvested yet were dark blue and heavy on the canes. George reached out and took one and ate it and said it was the best blueberry he had tasted in years. I said thank you. Helen said she would like to buy some before she left. I said I would put together a flat for each person who had come. The board tour ended with 8 people walking back to the community fence, carrying flats of late-season blueberries, and I thought a considerably different understanding of what was on the other side of the fence than they had arrived with. Helen Crawford continued as HOA president for another 2 years. In those 2 years, she addressed the community's parking situation through a different approach. She worked with the county to establish a shared-use parking arrangement with a church parking lot 3 blocks from the community that was available on weekday evenings and on weekends, which addressed the event overflow without requiring any additional land. The arrangement cost the HOA a modest annual fee and solved the problem cleanly. It was, I thought when I heard about it, a better solution than my farm would have been even if my farm had been available, because a shared-use parking arrangement with a willing party was sustainable and expandable in ways that a converted agricultural parcel would not have been. The EQIP contract ran its course and was renewed for another 8 years at renegotiated terms that reflected the improved soil health Tom's inspections had documented. The CRP easement continues and has 4 years remaining. The blueberries are in their 15th year of production, which is the beginning of their peak productive period. Blueberry bushes reach maximum productivity around years 15 to 25, and my operation is entering the most productive phase of its life. The federal regulatory network that protected the farm when the HOA threatened it is not something I think about daily. It is background, the structure underneath the operation that I know is there and that I maintain through my program compliance and my annual reporting and my practice of keeping all my contacts current. Most farmers who are enrolled in federal programs think about them the same way. They are not weapons or strategies. They are tools for farm viability and land stewardship, and the protection they provide is a byproduct of the obligations they impose. But when they are needed, they work with the particular authority of institutions that have existed for decades and that have been built to endure precisely because the things they protect, agricultural land, soil health, conservation commitments, are things that the nation has decided are worth protecting at a scale and with a permanence that local authority cannot provide. Tom Whitfield retired from the NRCS last year. His replacement is a younger agent named Karen who walked my farm in the spring and said it was one of the cleanest operations in her new district. I told her about the HOA situation. She laughed and said she had heard of stranger threats to enrolled land, but not many. I said I thought the strangest thing about it was that the people who made the plan had not asked a single question about what they were planning to use. She said in her experience that was how most agricultural land threats started. Someone looked at open ground and saw opportunity and did not ask what the ground was doing. I said the ground was growing blueberries. She said clearly. We walked the rest of the farm in the spring light, and the bushes were in bloom, and the smell of blueberry blossom is one of the cleanest and most optimistic smells I know. The smell of a year's production beginning and the promise of everything that a healthy piece of land can produce when it is maintained and protected and left to do what it does. The farm is fine. The blueberries grow. The HOA has its shared parking arrangement 3 blocks away. Everyone involved is better served by the outcome than they would have been by the alternative, including the HOA, though I am not sure they fully appreciated that when the USDA inspectors arrived. They do now. Thumbnail text. Line 1, HOA tried to bulldoze my blueberry farm for a parking lot. They had no idea it was enrolled in 2 federal USDA programs. Line 2, USDA inspectors arrived overnight and shut the whole plan down before a single shovel hit the ground. Classical building tractor.